Welcome back to Information Systems and Cybersecurity 375. Today we're going to talk about a really exciting topic. We're going to talk about some of the advanced features of CSS3. CSS3 is the new CSS. It's only about 2 years old, and it provides a lot of features for mobile web development, as well as the ability to do some fancy animations. Before we talk about CSS, I want to remind you that it's very important in your projects to cite your sources. I encourage you to get help with your projects, not from other students, but from the web and other online resources. But when you do that, you need to be careful not to cross the line into the territory that I consider cheating in this course. If you have questions about what that is, please read the syllabus. There's a link to the syllabus on the course website, on the portal. There's also quite a bit of information in Lecture 0. Feel free to rewatch Lecture 0 as many times as you need if you have questions. And if you're not sure, come ask me. You can email me almost any time. I will respond quickly. You can talk to me through the chat and the live stream during office hours or at the end of class. But ask, because it's really important that you don't cross that line. If you cheat in this class, I'm not very forgiving of that kind of behavior. If you want to properly cite your sources, the best way to do that is to use a comment in your code. It's important that the comment go near the code that was influenced by some other source. Even if it's just that you looked something up and you're using the idea. If you're not copying the code, you still need to cite your source if you looked something up. So the way that you do that is you put a comment in your code. In HTML, that's done with a special tag, angle bracket, bang, that's the exclamation point, dash dash, and then the comment. And then you close it with dash dash and the closing tag, closing angle bracket. In CSS, comments are a little different. You put slash star your comment and then star slash. The slash character is the forward slash. That's the one that's on the question mark key. It goes from top right to bottom left. And if you use that, your code will still work, but I'll have a little record that, yeah, you used a source to figure out this particular part of your CSS file. Again, I encourage you to do that. Go look things up. Just be careful not to copy and paste things wholesale, and make sure that when you do use an idea from the web or when you use code from the web, that you properly cite. So, cascading style sheets have been around for a long time now. CSS version 2, which is sort of the classic CSS, came out in 1998. Some of you probably weren't even alive in 1998. Well, maybe you were. And CSS2 has kind of a storied history. Because it's so old, there have been several attempts to revise it and bring it up to date. And CSS 2.1 was supposed to come out a number of times before it really did come out in 2011. It was proposed and then rejected and then proposed and accepted, but then pushed back into a working draft several times. So it was released in 2011. In 2014, the W3C released version 3 of CSS. And version 3 adds a lot of new features. It adds some new selectors. It also adds properties for doing animation, transformations, and for extra layout. We may not talk about those because they're pretty advanced. The problem with this is that a lot of the features of CSS3 are still experimental. By that I mean that not all browsers support them really well. So this feature may work really well in Chrome, but not in Firefox. And this feature will work in Firefox and Chrome, and maybe even Opera, but not in Internet Explorer. A lot of things don't work in Internet Explorer. Microsoft has trouble keeping up. So if you want to use these experimental features, you can actually get access to them. If a browser supports something, but it hasn't been well tested yet, what they do is they kind of hide the functionality. So if you want, for example, to put a header tag in that has rounded corners, you can use the border radius property to give your tag your element rounded corners. But if you use border radius, most browsers won't support it. They'll just ignore it and give you square corners. That's because while there is code for doing the rounded corners, it's not really tested well enough for them to release it. So if you want to access those features, you can, but you have to put a special prefix in front of your property. So for Firefox and other Mozilla-based browsers, that prefix is -mos. For Chrome and Safari and most mobile browsers, those browsers use a special rendering engine called WebKit. And so the tag, the property is -webkit- and then your property name. Internet Explorer and now Microsoft Echo use the MS prefix for Microsoft. Opera used to use the -O tag because it had its own rendering engine, but now Opera is based on WebKit like Safari and Chrome and pretty much everything else worth using, except for Firefox, and so you can use the -WebKit for new versions of Opera. So let me show you what this looks like. Suppose I have an H1 tag, and I want to style it so that it has rounded corners. I can do that by giving it a border radius, and in this case I'm going to give it a border radius of 1/4 of an inch. Now, browsers that don't support this property fully will just ignore it. So in most modern browsers, this will be ignored. Actually, that may not be true anymore. A lot has changed since the last time I used border radius, so it may be much better supported now. A lot of browsers may support border radius just like this. But suppose that I'm using a browser that doesn't. If I want to get support for it for the experimental version, I can do this. I can put in -moz -border radius : 0.25 inches. And this will enable experimental border radius support in Mozilla-based browsers like Firefox. Similarly, I can include support for Microsoft browsers like Internet Explorer, for Opera, old versions of Opera, and for all the WebKit browsers. And there's a lot of them. So here's an example of what that might look like. Over on the left, I have that same style sheet that I just showed you. I've got all the different border radius properties lined up there. And over on the right, I have a portion of a web page. I just have the body section. You would still, of course, need the head section and the HTML and /HTML tags and the doc type tag right at the top. But there's just two elements to this page. There's a header, an H1, a level 1 header, that has the text, "Interesting header with a rounded border." Beneath the header, there's going to be a paragraph that says some random text to make things interesting. Now, in order to really show you what a rounded border looks like, there needs to be something to be rounded. So I'm going to change some other properties to make the actual div, the H1 element, visible. I'm going to set the background color to green. I'm going to give it white text. I'm going to give it a 1 pixel solid blue border, and I'm going to center the text. The reason I'm doing that is that if I don't center the text, it'll be left aligned. And when I give it rounded corners, it'll actually chop off the tops of some of the letters. It'll chop off the I and the maybe part of the N or the T. So if I do that and render it, I get a page that looks like this. Notice that I've got my rounded corners. This is in Firefox, so it's probably applying the -moz -border radius. But it might, if it's now fully supported in Firefox, if border radius is fully supported, it might be using just the normal border radius property. The nice thing about this is I don't have to care. If I've got all of those in there, it'll ignore the ones that apply, that don't apply, and use the ones that do. So let's talk about some of the features of CSS3. One of the most exciting features is the ability to do transformations. Now, transformations allow you to move things around on the page, to position them accurately. Now, you say, well, why do I need that? Last time, you showed us how to use absolute positioning and relative positioning and fixed positioning to position things on the page. And you also showed us that you can float things to the left to make a multi-column format, or float things to the right. Why do you need another way to position things on the page? And the answer is that for static pages, for pages where things are fixed and don't move, that kind of positioning works really well. But if we want to animate our page, if we want to have motion and interaction, we need more control. So CSS transformations are going to allow us to move things and position them, but also to rotate them or to resize them, to scale them in 3 dimensions, actually. So why do we use transform instead of absolute positioning? If we were using absolute or fixed or relative positioning from CSS2, we could do that, but it doesn't allow us to do rotation or scaling. And also, it only allows us to position elements on fixed pixel boundaries. And the reason for that is that the positioning rules in CSS use integers. Integer pixel amounts. They're stored as integers. And that's not very good if we want to have smooth animation. So in CSS3 transformations, we actually use real numbers. We use rational numbers, basically decimals, to represent the positions of the elements. And so even though I can't draw something that's between 2 pixels, if I can remember that the box is really between these 2 pixels and not right on it, the animation will not jump around. It'll be really nice and smooth. Because when I do matrix multiply and the other mathematical operations I have to do to perform the animation, I'll be using all of the information, not throwing some of it away because I'm doing integer rounding. if that was too complicated for you, you don't really need to know the mechanics of the graphics. When you come to Longwood, I hope someday, you can take computer graphics and learn all about the wonders of how calculus helps us display three-dimensional objects on the computer screen. If we use CSS3 transformations, we can actually position things on sub-pixel boundaries. In other words, we can slide things so that they're halfway between two pixels. It doesn't show up on the screen that way because there's no way to show something that's not on a pixel, but the math works nicer and we get nice smooth animations. So we do this with a special CSS property, the transform property. And the transform property uses several different methods to position the elements. One of them is the translate method. The translate method will take an element and move it from its normal location on the page. So here's some example code. I've created an element with ID set to box 1. And I'm going to transform that element by translating it 300 pixels to the right and 30 pixels up. And the way that I do that is I use the translate method. Now you saw methods when we talked about colors because we used an RGB method. Notice here I have the word translate and then I have some parentheses. And then inside the parentheses I have a comma-separated list. When I was using the RGB method, my three values were red, green, and blue, the amount of red, green, and blue to make the object. In this case, my two properties are the amount to shift horizontally and the amount to shift vertically. And they're expressed in a number of pixels to shift to the right and a number of pixels to shift down the page. So in other words, the origin is in the top left corner and it increases going down and to the right. That's a very common computer science standard. In computer graphics, we tend to put things in, I guess, the fourth quadrant. So, with negative axes, it's weird. So here, I'm going to shift the element over 300 pixels to the right, and because I'm using a negative number, I'm going to shift 30 pixels up. Right? A positive number would shift down, negative number would shift up. I'm also going to have some other boxes on my page, and all of my boxes are going to belong to the box class. So I'm going to set their class element to be box. I'm going to give all of the boxes a blue background. They're all going to be 2 inches wide. Remember, a block displayed element will automatically expand to fill the entire space unless I set the width. If I set the width, I can make it smaller. So I'm going to limit these divs to only be 2 inches wide. I'm going to give them no margin, but I am going to give them 1/4 inches of padding so that the text doesn't hit the edge of the box. I want a little bit of room around the text. So that'll look like this. So notice I have 3 boxes. They're all blue, because I gave them a blue background. But one of the boxes isn't lined up with the others. The middle box I have shifted to the right by 300 pixels, and I've shifted it up 30 pixels. If you look really carefully at the screen, you can see that it's been moved up so that it would kind of overlap the bottom of the rectangle above it. If I had them in a vertical row, there'd be some overlap. So I can translate elements. Another method that I can apply is the rotate method. Rotating allows me to rotate an element clockwise, and I specify the amount to rotate in degrees. I believe CSS also supports radians and gradians, which are other units of rotation, but degrees are nice and easy to use, so we'll do that. Again, I'm going to have a bunch of boxes, and I'm going to apply the same styling to the boxes I did before. They're going to have blue backgrounds. They're going to be 2 inches wide. The only difference here is that I was a little bit smarter this time, and I gave them white text so you can actually read the text. And now I'm going to do something different to box 1. Just to box 1, because remember, it's the only box that has ID set to box 1. I'm going to apply 2 transformations. First, I'm going to translate it 300 pixels to the right and 20 pixels up. I don't remember why I changed that. There was a reason. I think if I shifted it more, it clipped the screen worse. And then I'm going to apply the second transformation. I'm going to rotate it 45 degrees clockwise. So that looks like this. Notice that even though I only shifted it 20 pixels up, the corner of the box is still cropped off by the top of the screen. That can happen when you rotate because now the dimensions have shifted, so what used to be width is now partly height, and so that corner is up off the screen. If there was text in that section of my div, the user couldn't see it now, couldn't read it. So you have to be kind of careful with these transformations, how you use them. So I've showed you how we can move things around with translate. We can rotate them. Another thing that we can do is called scale. Scale means to resize an element. So we can scale an element, in this case, in both the horizontal dimension and the vertical dimension, the x and the y planes. So, axes. So here I'm going to apply again 2 transformations to box 1. This time I'm going to shift it 600 pixels to the right and 20 pixels up. And now I'm going to scale it. I'm going to scale it by 80% in the horizontal dimension, so it's going to be a little bit narrower than it was. I'm going to shrink it to be only 80% of its former width. But I'm going to expand it in the vertical dimension, so it's going to be 2.5 times as tall as it used to be. And if you look at the image, you can see what's happened. It looks fat, but it's actually shorter than the other boxes. It looks fat because it's so much taller that it's actually clipping, and so the ratios are off. So we can use these transformations to do animation, and one way to do that is to use a new feature of CSS called transitions. So one really easy way to do this is to use the hover selector, pseudo selector. For example, I can have an H1 tag, and I can style it how I want. And then I can create a new rule that says if the mouse is hovering over the H1 tag, transform it by scaling it by a factor of 2. So here I have H1:hover. That's how I apply rules to the H1 element only when the mouse is hovering over it. And what I'm going to do is scale it in both dimensions by 2. I'm going to double it in size. This will expand the header when the mouse moves over it. Now, unfortunately, in my slides, I can't really show you that because if I put the mouse cursor over the box, nothing will happen. It's not an actual web page, it's just an image. So let me quickly switch to a web browser and show you what this looks like. Here I am in Chrome, and you'll notice at the top I've got this text header box. And right now it's not very big, but if I move the mouse over it, now I'm in hover mode, and notice it doubles in size. So when I move the mouse off, it shrinks again because now it's not in the hover state. When I move the mouse over it, it grows again. So this is a real easy way to do animation. I want to point out that animation isn't just for decoration. Yes, it looks cool, but it's also functional. When you use animation, you can give the user a visual indication of what element they have selected. So for example, in a nav bar, I might use this to indicate which link the user is about to click on. And that way they have a cue that tells them, oh, no, that's not the right link. Or yes, that's the link I meant to click on. You can do this with a button, too, so you have a visual clue which button they're clicking on. Kind of a nice little bit of feedback. It's really important that you provide visual cues like this, but it's also really important that you're careful because not all users can see the page. Remember, disabled users, visually impaired users, can't actually see the graphics on the page. So your page shouldn't rely on this functionality. It should provide it so that most users have easy access to the page, but you should provide alternative ways of communicating information for users with handicaps. Let's go back to the presentation. So if we do these animations, we actually can exert some control over them using the CSS transition property. And the CSS transition property allows us to introduce a delay into an animation or to set the duration of the animation. So here's an example. So here's the syntax for the transition property at the bottom of this page. Here I'm going to say transition : and then I tell it which property to animate. I can actually animate almost any CSS property we've talked about. I can change the width, I can change the color, the background color, the font size, and I can do it over a duration. So transition, and then : and then the property to change, the duration of the effect, how long should it take, an optional timing function that I can specify, and then a delay. So in this example, I have an H1 tag that I've set to be 100 pixels wide. I've given it margin 0 auto. You may remember this is a trick that I apply for centering something in the page. I have aligned the text so that it's centered. I've given it a blue background, white text, and I'm using the WebKit transition field and the transition field to animate the width over a period of 2 seconds. Then I create an H1 hover property, and I set the width to 200 pixels. So if I'm not hovering, the width is 100 pixels. When I move a mouse over the H1 tag, it's going to expand to 200 pixels. But because I've set the transition property, whenever the width changes, it's going to change using the transition properties. In other words, the duration is going to be 2 seconds. It will take it 2 seconds to expand from 100 pixels to 200 pixels. The transition timing function actually affects the speed of the transition. So by default, it uses a linear timing function. That means that it's constant speed. If I'm growing an element, if I'm animating a change in the width, that width will change linearly. It'll change at the same speed over the course of, in this case, the 2 seconds. Another way to do it is to do an ease-in transition. That starts slow but then speeds up. I can also do an ease-out that starts fast and then slows down. Or just ease, which starts slow, goes fast, and then slows down again. Or ease in out is the other way around. It goes fast, slow, fast. So for example, I could set the property transition-timing-function to ease out. I can also set the transition delay. That's just a number of seconds to wait before the animation happens. So for example, if I hover over my tag, instead of animating right away, it'll wait a second and then expand. If I want to apply an animation to more than one element, CSS3 provides a really neat feature. It allows me to create an animation keyframe. So here's an example of how to do that. You use the keyword @keyframes, and then you give your animation a name. I'm going to call this animation slide right. And in curly braces, you tell it how to do the animation. And essentially what you do is you give it several different places in time and tell it, at this time, I want this property set to this. By this time, the property should be set to this. So here I am going to do from and to. So at the beginning of the animation, the from, it should be 10% of the page from the left. By the time the animation ends, that's the to field, I want it to be 20% of the width from the left. So I'm going to move this from 10% to 20%. I'm going to slide it to the right, whatever it is. Now I can apply my slide right animation, not just to one element, but to several. So for example, if I have a div with the ID set to slider, I can make a div hash slider rule. And I can tell it to use the animation with the name slide right, and I can set the duration to 2 seconds. Or 4 seconds, or whatever I want. I can also have a tag, an h1 tag, in the wobble class. And if it has class wobble, I can set rules for it using h1.wobble. I can give it the same animation name, so it'll apply the slide right animation, but I can configure it so that the duration is 5 seconds instead of 2, and I can also introduce an animation delay of 10 seconds. So if I have an h1 tag, it will slide right after I load the page, but it's going to wait 10 seconds first, and then it's going to slowly slide right. It'll take 5 seconds to get from 10% to 20%. Instead of from and to, you can use checkpoints. So here I've got a slide variable keyframe that I've created, and at 0%, it's going to be 10% from the left. At 50% of the time, it's going to be 60% from the left, and it'll change the color to blue. By 100%, by the end of the animation, it'll have slid left 70%, and it'll be colored red. So it's going to animate the position and the color. So this is all really cool stuff, but really the biggest and most important part of CSS3 is support for smartphones and mobile devices. So suppose that I have a tiny little smartphone screen. If I pull up a website designed for desktop computers with large screens, it may not look very nice, and I'm going to have to scroll around a lot to interact with it. That's really annoying and really frustrating. So I may actually want 2 completely different sets of styles on my page. I want the same information, the same HTML and content, but I want it to appear completely differently if I'm on a mobile device or if I'm on my computer at home. So CSS2 gave us sort of a stepping stone to this. There was something called the @media rule. You could take a CSS rule and you could put the words @media and a media type and apply that rule only when you're printing or when you're displaying on the screen. So for example, if I wanted to print with a large font, but when I'm on the screen to use a small font, I could say @media print, and then I could put a font size rule of 24 points. But @media screen, I could set the font to 12 points. So on my computer, it'll be in a tiny little 12-point font, but when I print, it's going to be bigger in a 24-point font. It'll show up this way in a print preview too, by the way, so I'm not just printing blind. I can actually see what it looks like before I print. The problem with this is that it doesn't handle tablets with different size screens. It only lets me decide between printing and being on a screen, and I think there might have been a handheld thing that was kind of poorly defined. So the CSS3 standard allowed us to specialize these media queries a little bit. What do I mean by that? Well, suppose that I have a rule at media all, that'll apply to print and screen and everything else, and I set the font size to 12 points. Now I can create a new rule that says, okay, if my screen is large enough, make the font bigger. So by default, I'll have a small font that will work well on a mobile device. But if I have a wide screen, a big screen like a desktop screen, I can make the font bigger. How do I do that? Well, I say at media screen, and then I say and in parentheses I can put a property. In this case, I'm going to say the minimum width is 480 pixels. If my screen is at least 480 pixels wide, make the font bigger. Make it a 48-point font. If it's not 480 pixels wide, it won't do this. It'll keep the default font of 12 points. So this is really cool. It's great because mobile is really important now, and this is really the big win for CSS3. So play around with these, and if you have a smartphone, see what you can do to make your pages look nice on the phone, but also look nice on the desktop. So here's a summary of what we talked about today. You can access experimental features, browser-specific properties using the prefixes -webkit, -ms, -mos, and -o. You can do transformations using CSS3, such as translating, rotating, scaling. We didn't talk about skew. You can skew, which means that you can make things slant, kind of. You can pull them, stretch them in two different directions. You can also do a perspective transformation that takes something in 3 dimensions and projects it into 2. And you can do all these transitions for animation that we talked about. And finally, you can use media queries to adapt your web page to different kinds of devices. So I will see you next time.